Hi everyone and welcome to episode 2 of Future Work World. My name is Barry Winkless. I'm Chief Strategy Officer of Cpl Group and head of the Future of Work Institute.
And I'm Elysia Hegarty, Associate Director at the Future of Work Institute.
And the Future Work World podcast is all about this thing that we call work, the future trends, the current thinking, and all sorts of madness when it comes to how we do this thing called work.
And we'll interview experts to inspire you to make changes to better improve work and life.
So Elysia, what have we got to talk about today in terms of our big trend or our big theme? What have you got for us?
Yeah, so this week I was looking at remote work and hybrid working models. These are still significant trends at the moment, allowing flexibility in where and how people work. Companies like Google and Microsoft, Twitter have really embraced remote working and hybrid models, offering flexibility to where and how their employees work, whether it's in the office or from home. And then other tech giants like Amazon and Facebook have adopted similar approaches, as well as some startups like GitHub and Slack. So it's not necessarily just for, the big organizations, but also I think what's really interesting in this space when I was researching it was that we've also seen organizations like Netflix and Apple who adopted an office first model, very, very quickly after the pandemic. And then they made really swift changes to adopt more flexible working structures when they saw an increase in attrition as a result. And I know even from our own research recently as well, we've seen that actually a lot of candidates are looking for elements of flexibility as well in terms of how and where they work. So I think flexibility is here to stay. I think organizations probably need to think about the types of flexibility that they can offer beyond even where people work, so offering different flexible shifts or things like phased retirement options as flexibility, additional leave like birthday leave, things like that I think can also add to this whole element of blended work.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have a couple of really interesting concepts here, right? So just to kind of keep us and keep the listeners interested. Neuro Architecture, and one which I've coined myself in a recent article, meta working, right? So Neuro Architecture really is about this idea of how physical spaces connect to our mood and our well-being, right? And I'd also extend that, to be quite honest, to virtual spaces in which we work as well. There's a whole load of really interesting research out there at the moment talking about this idea. And obviously we know that architecture in the physical space has an ability to change perception, change mood and all this kind of good stuff. But I'm equally interested in that kind of thinking applied to the virtual world, and how we can create these types of environments, whether physical or digital or virtual, that really inspire us in some way or help us to be more effective in some way or improve our well-being, albeit in small ways. So I think, that neuro architecture is a relatively new field, and it's really about that connection between place and our overall well-being. I know, Elysia, we've done a lot of work on the wellness side, looking across various areas from emotional to, mental to spiritual, etc., etc. So I think that's a really interesting one. I think a big thing I've been doing a bit of work on is this idea of meta working, right? So in this world where we're really moving towards this seamless blend of working in physical spaces, in digital spaces and in virtual spaces, really it's more around how do we optimize those kind of spaces for the type of work that we're doing. And I think one of the big things for my own work is this idea of what type of work best lends itself to the best possible place, if that makes sense, right? So very simply, I talked about, and it's probably maybe worth sharing some of the ideas, within the article. I talk about this idea of 4 types of work, and you'll appreciate this one, Elysia, because you do probably all 4 of them, right? So process work, okay, which is really more repetitive, task-based work, it's ongoing. So for example, something like a mortgage application process, right, is what I would call lots of little tasks in there that are repetitive. We got to do them, etc. Second one for me is project work. So these are small, medium, large style projects that ultimately have some type of a finite element to them, right? They come to an end, and they generally involve groups from different countries or different parts of the business, or whatever that may be. There's the third bit, which I call purpose work. which really is work around engagement, culture, all that kind of good stuff. It really drives the personality of a business. And then finally, growth work. So this could be work developing our own skills, developing skills within groups, etc., etc. And the reason I suppose I'm bringing those 4 types of work up is because I think ultimately, if we look into our crystal ball into the future, we're probably going to be looking at, what's the optimal mix of that type of work and the types of places that we do them, right? So there's obviously a good argument for, particularly important sessions around a project to be done within the physical realm, okay? But then equally, there's other things like, let's say improving our overall emotional intelligence that actually might be best done within the virtual spaces. There's really interesting work coming out at the moment showing how you can use virtual and immersive technology to really make emotional intelligence tangible and real. So I don't know what your thoughts are on all of that, Elysia. I know.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and
while.
I think what we're seeing as well from some of the work that we're doing with clients is they're coming to us asking how do we reimagine our offices? How do we get people to want to come back, not just mandate people come back and then they end up leaving because we're not creating these experiences. So I think it's really important to think about, if we are bringing people back into the office, what are we bringing them back for? We don't really want people in the office on Teams calls all the time, on not using the meeting rooms because there aren't enough anymore, and all these different things. So I think it's important for organizations, if they are considering their flexibility model, how they're going to not just reimagine the virtual space because yes, it's everyone's healthier and happier because they've better work-life balance because they're working from home, but yet we have these offices and people still also need to be able to be with one another and collaborate together and create these kind of moments that matter in an organization. So we're seeing organizations create these kind of engagement hubs or collaboration style days as well, just as you kind of said, leave some of the work that you might do at home, the process, the admin, those kind of tasks. I definitely work better when I'm at home, but I'll go into the office to build those relationships, to have those meetings. We'll rarely have any Teams calls when I'm in the office at all. It's all really about creating those engagements, and I think that's really important.
I think you're right. I think the big one for me is, if what's our bottom line in some of these conversations? I think what you said at the start is important. I think whether leaders like it or not, a level of flexibility, and flexibility as a concept is here to stay. So I think that's, people really have to get realistic with this. I think probably the press has done a little bit more damage than what it was worth, because it highlighted very small number of businesses that were moving more towards that, must be in the office 5 days a week type model. It got a lot of press, but in reality, percentage wise, it's quite a low percentage of organizations. So I think the key thing for me is that idea of flexibility is here. I think the second thing I'd like to really underline is this idea of the meta working. So, think across the realms, what works and what new innovations can we create to, really make people work, in really exciting and different ways. And I think that idea as well, Elysia, of let's think about that physical space in a different way. Let's think about how we're actually going to use it versus how we think we're going to use it, because I think that's been an experience in various companies we've spoken to, the difference between how they thought their office was going to be used versus how it's actually being used, and then having to almost think about redesigning just as they've launched a design. So
Exactly. Yeah.
And now on to our interview for today. And in this section, Elysia is going to interview Ros Degan, who's currently CEO of OMass Therapeutics, a biotechnology company identifying new medicines against highly validated but inadequately drugged targets in immunology and rare diseases. Now, it's safe to say, I think, Elysia, Ros has a lot of experience, a lot of leadership experience, and a really, really interesting career. So I know you and Ros are going to talk a lot about leadership, where it is today and what it's going to look like into the future. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Elysia and to Ros.
Hi Ros, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Yeah, delighted to have you on the show. Maybe you could start, it might be useful to tell listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today.
So just to introduce myself, I'm Ros Degan. I'm CEO of a company called OMass Therapeutics. So we're an Oxford University spin-out looking at biological systems in high resolution. So how did I get here? Via a pretty winding path, including multiple different disciplines and geographies. Most recently, I was actually 13 years in the US, but I got sufficiently excited by this particular company's technology that I came back to the UK in order to take this role.
Awesome. And whereabouts were you in the US?
I was in Boston most recently and in Philadelphia before that. And then I had a little stint in New York, but that was earlier in my career.
Amazing. So well-traveled for sure.
Well-traveled, a little bit in France, a little bit in Belgium as well over the course of that period.
Nice. And so I suppose today we're talking about leadership and, the future of work as it's evolving. And so too are the requirements for leadership. So like we've already seen leaders taking a huge jump in the last 3 or 4 years, mainly due to COVID and the pandemic. Now, we've had to, many leaders are leading people in geographically dispersed teams. And for others, perhaps, who work on site anyways, with employees, maybe much hasn't necessarily changed, except for maybe the expectations for employees. And look, we'll talk about that as well as we progress through our conversation. But to kick off, I'd really love to ask, what does leadership mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it means two main things. So the first of those, I think, is vision and direction. I think the leader has to be able to set that direction for the company. And then the second piece is really inspiring people to follow that direction. And it's enabling other people to do their best work. I remember that fundamental transition in my life when I realized that I was no longer sort of directly responsible for a particular function. So I was no longer an individual contributor towards an area of expertise, but it was much more about enabling other people to be successful. And I think that's, when you think about leadership, the important aspect of leadership.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be quite a challenge. It can be quite a jump for a lot of people. And I know even myself, it can be quite hard to transition from that individual contributor to enabling and creating that shared vision. What, I suppose, strategies did you use to move to that transition?
Well, in full transparency, and one of my important attributes of leadership, I think, is vulnerability, is I found it hard. And I think it's hard for many people, particularly when what's got you to where you are in an organization, actually being considered for leadership, is your skill in a particular expertise to getting a particular function done. And then suddenly you've got to transition into this position that enables other people. And so the way I went about it was to admit to myself that I needed help with that transition, not just from my boss at the time, who was very supportive, but also I took on a coach. So I had a business coach who worked with me and helped me to really think about the aspects of my skill set that were better attributed towards my leadership qualities than my individual contributor qualities. And there were those qualities in existence. I just hadn't really been playing those cards up to that point in my career. And so it was a real switch for me to actually think about what aspects of my natural skill set was I going to actually play at this point in my career in order to be successful.
Amazing. And I love that. I think the vulnerability piece is really important to admit, because it is a transition and we are, constantly learning. And I've spoken to many people in very, very senior positions, very similar to yourself, who will even say, they have an element of imposter syndrome, as well. And they're kind of like, how can I be so senior in an organization? I'm going to get found out here. Someone's going to find out. Really, I don't know. I don't have it all figured out. So I think that element of vulnerability is really, really important, particularly in very senior positions.
Yeah, I completely agree, because ultimately you're going to be leading people, some of whose work you do understand, and others where they really have an expertise far beyond your own in their discipline. And that's what you need in order to be successful as an organization. And to get comfortable about how to enable those people is about leadership, is all about leadership as well. And that's a transition that you have to go through in your career, and get comfortable with the fact that you're not the most informed person, but you have to find ways of making that individual as successful as they can possibly be for the organization.
Yeah. And so I guess in a role, I suppose, as yourself, CEO, the most senior person, in the organization, I guess that's equally as important then to have a strong team around you.
Yeah, it's really important. And when I joined OMass, I already knew I had some fantastic people in the organization. And that was a big driver for me joining the organization in the first place. So we already had a chief scientific officer who had great credibility in the space and who I liked individually as a person. And we had a fantastic leader of finance and operations already in place. And so I knew that those two individuals were very strong and that they were complementary also in terms of their skill set matching with my skill set. So I felt coming in that I already had an emerging leadership team, because ultimately it's a team effort. The other piece of this is that we're looking at leadership as if it's only taking place at the senior levels of the organization, but leadership takes place all the way through an organization. And it's having leaders and developing those leadership skills across an organization that is important for me to think about in terms of developing the next generation of leaders, and also just in terms of the functional success of the organization. Is people need to be able to lead in different environments, even if they're relatively junior in an organization.
Yeah. That's really important, as you say, as well. And what are some of the initiatives that you do at OMass to develop the emerging leaders?
Yeah, so I think there is formal training, of course. So we do think about formal training, but we also think much more about on-the-job training. So having that coaching support. So coaching is something we've done across the organization. We've done lunch and learn sessions for everybody to be able to flex and develop their coaching skills. So I think that's a nice aspect of the organization that we have to develop the next set of leaders. The other piece of leadership that I think is incredibly important and for me and for development is feedback. So you have to emphasize the importance of feedback and get comfortable as an organization with giving each other feedback and being invested in each other's development. Because ultimately, if you don't give people feedback, both positive and negative, then it means effectively you don't care enough about that individual's development. And seeing feedback as caring, and caring is actually one of our values at OMass, I think is really important. So those are two things that we think about in developing the next generation of leaders.
Yeah, amazing. I've never heard it being positioned like that. Feedback is caring. That's a really nice way to put it, because sometimes it can be challenging as a leader even to have to give someone feedback, even if it's tough feedback, that's ultimately going to help them grow, and to receive it. Sometimes I've been given feedback that I don't particularly like, but then you go away and you think about it and you come back and you're like, okay, yes, I see where you're coming from, I appreciate that. So I think there are elements of having to be okay with giving it, but also being okay with embracing it.
Absolutely. And I think because I believe in vulnerability as well, I always talk about the moments in my career, as I have today, where I've taken feedback on board. So part of my coaching was absolutely taking 360 feedback. And I've done that at various different points in my career and how useful it's been. And I fundamentally believe that I wouldn't be in the position I'm in now if I hadn't taken the time to get that feedback and to respond to that feedback. And so I feel it's a gift for people to get feedback. And if we all talk about it that way and accept the fact that I'm still not the finished product as a leader, we never are, then that makes the leadership journey actually so much more exciting, the fact that we're always still on it.
Yeah, I like that as well, because sometimes people think that leadership is a destination, and it can be challenging then to kind of continue to move up the chain, and you need some element of fulfillment, but also knowing that there is no finished product, and leadership is constantly evolving as well, and leadership skills. And look, as I mentioned earlier as well, COVID is one thing. We all had to evolve and deal with that kind of situation and leading people in a different situation, and now it's still continuing to change. So no, it's important what you mentioned there as well. But speaking on kind of the evolution and that, I'd love to understand from your perspective, even broadly in terms of leadership, or even leadership in your particular sector, where do you feel it will evolve in the next kind of 5-10 years, and what do we need to do to prepare for it?
Yeah, so I think when I think about how leadership's evolving, it is evolving to focus more on individuals and focus more on differences, and to focus more on purpose. So that does set us up really well in my industry, because what we're ultimately trying to do is make medicines that enable people to feel better. So that is a great purpose, but you need to be able to celebrate that organizationally and attract people to it, even when it's quite distant, actually, where you're going to be able to make that impact. And so that tying that purpose, mission-driven leadership together with bringing people in early in the journey as a company is an important aspect of how I think our leadership is evolving. I also think that piece about individuals, so just customizing. I think previously organizations were sort of thought as a collective being that you could cater to the needs of the organization. But the organization doesn't really have needs. The individuals within the organization have needs. And so you have to think about those needs as individuals, and we all act differently to different scenarios. Now, part of that is recognizing that culture can tie those individuals together, and the importance of building and valuing culture within organizations, I think, is only going to get stronger, because otherwise, in this world of individuals where you've lost this sort of collective organism that you can treat without thinking about its individual needs, then it can be quite difficult for leaders to navigate that. And it's culture that really ties that together. And thinking about every organization has a culture. It's sort of not something that you give as a leader and it's top down. It won't work if it doesn't match your own values and principles that you act on and model. But ultimately, whether you like it or not, it's the behaviors that your organization rewards, allows, accepts, pushes back on. And so culture is really important, and thinking about how you make that a strength for your organization, how you recruit against it, how you merit performance against it. I think those are all really important parts of leadership and are only going to get more important. I think the other thing is that people have broader stakeholder kind of interests, I think. So when you think about environmental impact, that's become much more important to individuals when thinking about where they want to work. And so that's something that as leaders we need to pay attention to and think about that environmental footprint of our organizations, even from the very earliest days. So that's something we've done at OMass, is we've had a committee, a group of individuals who self-volunteer to be on the group that really thinks about environmental impact and how we can minimize our environmental impact right from the get-go, even as a very small organization. So I think it's a number of these different aspects which are only going to intensify as we think about leadership looking forward.
Yeah, and I like that you've not, like, everything there's very, very relevant, very important, but you using the word intensify, like there's nothing necessarily new that's coming in terms of leadership. It's all still there. It's just evolving, or it's becoming a little bit more intensified, or it might be shifting slightly the focus in certain ways. The mission-driven leadership is really important. I love how you also mentioned about, the individuality of each individual, because that would be something that, we would talk an awful lot about at the Future of Work Institute. This human-centric approach. I like to use the analogy of kind of houseplants. As you can see, I have a houseplant here in the back that some of them tend to die. This is one of my better ones. But I like to use this as an analogy in terms of, if you were to think of the individuals in your organization as all different types of houseplants, they all need different types of watering, different types of feed. They need them at different times of the day, and some need more light, less light, all these different things. So finding out and understanding those nuances of what each of those individuals need is challenging, and it takes time. But yes, as you say, it's underpinned by this overall culture. It's really important in order for them to be able to thrive, to understand and apply their kind of individual needs. So I think that's really important. I love that you mentioned that as well.
Completely agree. And I think it also comes back to that fundamental skill of listening, because ultimately, if you assign to every individual your own needs, wants and motivations and aspirations, then you're missing something, because you're not actually listening to what they want, what they value, what's important to them for their development. And so I think leaders need to get better and better at listening, because we are all individuals. And I think in the past, there's been a sort of, maybe this is distant past, sort of an acceptance of people as needing to conform. Whereas now I think we're accepting that people don't have to conform, and that you can actually have a very diverse organization, diversity across all the broadest ways of thinking about that, and enable that. And that's actually the best organization and the best way to be successful. But only if you don't force conformation, because if you force a diverse organization to conform, then you're not going to end up benefiting from the diversity.
No, exactly. And I think this goes back to one of the things that you mentioned at the start, which is about creating that vision, that shared vision, and enabling that as well, which I think is a really important foundation layer for, giving people the somewhat, I suppose, autonomy over their careers and their journey, and that as well. And I think leadership is probably moving into more of being a facilitator and enabler of people, as opposed to
I'm here to tell you what to do and to manage people. I think that's definitely a very old, outdated approach.
Yeah, completely. It's much more about curating, about facilitating, enabling. It's all of it's empathy, it's authenticity, which I actually, embrace. I think I wouldn't have done well in the old model where you had to sort of bring a very conformed single piece of yourself into the work environment and lead in a very singular way. I actually embrace the authenticity that's needed for successful leadership today, the ability to be vulnerable, the ability to talk about feedback. And I think it drives better innovation. And I think that's one of the pieces of this that we all need to think about, is that why are we doing this? It's often because change is so rapid and there's a lot of technology that changes. And so if you don't embrace change and don't embrace these individual contributions, then you're not going to be innovative. And if you're not innovative, then you're not going to be successful.
Yeah, and you've got to be vulnerable and okay to fail, and be okay with letting people fail as a leader as well, in order to kind of foster that innovation. Sometimes some of the best innovation comes out of the biggest failures, because that's when you get your aha moments, really. So I think it's a kind of always allowing people, in order to be successful, giving them the space to fail as well.
Absolutely. That psychological safety, that ability to take risk, the ability to think about risk in a way that is appropriate for your particular organisation. We, as an organisation, live in a world of very high risk, because making a medicine is about the hardest thing there is that you can possibly do. And the vast majority of times you will fail. And so it's really making sure that you take your decisions carefully, you get comfortable with a certain level of risk, but also it's smart risk taking and it's smart allocation of resources. So it's a balance.
Yes, yeah, for sure. On a personal note, if you're open to sharing, what was one of your biggest leadership mistakes or vulnerabilities, let's say, and what did you learn from it? How did it make you a better leader?
Yeah, I think the first time I was really put in a position of leadership that was, it was a challenging role, because I was effectively setting up a new subsidiary in the US for a company that already had a headquarters in the UK. And I think I was hoping or thinking that leadership was going to rely more on having a title. So I was hoping that my first leadership experience, I'd be able to rely on the fact that I was the boss, and therefore that would give you a certain amount of leeway and ability to kind of get things done. But in this particular environment, I still really wasn't the boss, because the boss was in the UK at the headquarters and I was the facilitator or so-called president of the US subsidiary. But my peer group was effectively, the people that I was trying to facilitate. And therefore, if you go in with any assumed sense of control, which I think is where I started, was like an assumed sense of, well, I've been given the role of being president over here, so therefore I need to be the one sort of making the decisions. Because ultimately we all still reported to the CEO and we were at the same sort of C-suite level in the organization holistically. And so that was just the wrong way to go about it, because in that environment, it was much more about working as a team, enabling each other and being a facilitator of what needed to happen on a site level, but not to assert any sense of authority because it didn't exist. And so I think that was a good lesson for me, because it reminded me that actually any power that sort of comes directly from authority is probably going to be a slightly weakening power anyway, because it's when people want to work in a certain way and when you've talked through, your differences of view in recognition of your shared purpose that the best decisions are made. And that was in the end the environment that I needed to be successful in that role. And I think that that's something I've taken through here, that ultimately I try not to sort of make decisions that are holistically, you should do it because I'm the CEO. It's more about, let's try and find a commonality of purpose that brings us to the best decision for the organization. So that's an important lesson for me.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. And I think that, I don't think I think it's an important message. I think a lot of leaders have probably been in a very similar position and had some very similar stories. Even as you were speaking, I was thinking even of some of my own mistakes, that I have made. And one of the biggest ones that I made when I went first into a leadership position was not asking for help and thinking that I needed to have all of the answers, and you don't necessarily need to. So I think, it kind of comes back to one of your initial conversations that you said about, the kind of collective, having the team around you and the strong team around you. That's really important. So I thank you for sharing that. I think it'd be beneficial for anyone really listening.
Thank you. Yes, no, absolutely.
Yeah. And so what would be your one piece of advice for leaders of the future or leaders preparing for the future?
My one piece of advice would probably be to spend enough time being thoughtful about the role. It's so hard because business life is very demanding and there's a lot of things being thrown at you at all times. And that's when it can go wrong, is you just don't have time to be deliberate about your own performance or your own impact. Particularly when you get into a more senior role, because if anything, I'd say the only thing the title does is it gets you an ability to sort of act badly without being called out as quickly, because because people aren't necessarily going to give you feedback unless it's asked for. And so if you sort of behave in a certain way, you may not get the same cues as you would at different levels in an organization, because even at the level below you, you're kind of held to account a bit more by your fellow peer group. But as CEO, you don't have a sort of internal peer group, so to speak. You have your board, but they don't see you on a day-to-day basis at work. So you have to be able to have honest conversations with the people who report to you and try and set up that feedback culture. And you have to spend time yourself actually, criticizing yourself and trying to be honest with yourself about where you still need to work and still need to improve and what needs time. So that's a really important thing, I think, that I would advise people. Don't just think when you get to the position where you don't have anyone sort of that you directly report to, so to speak, that therefore you're the finished product.
Yes, you're constantly learning. It's an evolution even of self. And I think one of the key things that has come across to me, even speaking with you in the last 20 minutes, is being very self-aware. And I think it seems like you've put steps in place yourself to make sure that that's happened, whether it's been coaching or feedback loops with peers or surrounding yourself with people who will give you the counsel that's needed. And I think that's really important aspect of leadership that's needed.
Yeah, completely agree. Self-awareness, that's a fundamental part of leadership.
And so what strategies do you use to build trust and communication amongst team members?
Yeah, so I think communication is the fundamental heartbeat of an organization, and it's one that you can never get absolutely right because it's so real time. And so thinking about it and being, constructive about how you put in place as many routes to communication as you can, I think, is the first thing. You can't really over communicate, I think, in an organization. So one of the things I do is make sure that for my direct reports, they have at least a weekly slot with me that is preserved, ideally. So sometimes we may not use it, but at least they know it's time on the calendar that they can check in with me, and and I can give them information, so that it means you're not necessarily bothering each other all the time. And then I think it's also understanding each other's communication needs, because some people may hate it that you're, pinging them at sort of 7 o'clock at night, and other people respond to it absolutely fine. It really doesn't bother them that much. And if some, maybe they're always at their desk at 7 o'clock in the evening, or they like to do a little bit because they actually take off between 4 and 5 to go and pick up their kids from school. So it's trying to understand what's going to work for different people. I think, again, to that individualism, that catering to people as individuals rather than just everybody conforming to a particular type is important. And then I actually do send regular emails to the organization. I started it under COVID. So for a period, I used to send a daily email for quite a long period, I think probably about a year. I sent a daily email, and I used it for just, I think to solidify the sharing of the experience, to communicate things that needed to be communicated under COVID about policies and about approaches to different, aspects of lockdowns or rules that were coming through, and also just to tie us together. And it became, and I always used to start with a quote, and I ended up with a cartoon, and so it's quite nice because it makes me think about different aspects of sort of organizational life. So I'll talk about some which are about marketing, or some which are about the importance of teamwork, or other ones the importance about feedback. And so I have themes that I do, and that's evolved now, so that instead of me writing all the daily emails, we started to spread it out across the organization, because I was off at one point and somebody stepped in, and then it was like, oh, it was such a relief to hear from somebody else about what they were doing. So now my leadership team does it sort of semi-regularly. I do kind of 2 a week, and then it's opened across the organizations. Everybody has the chance to sort of write to everybody about one of their days. And it's a way that people share sort of other things going on in their lives. People often, post photographs of, vacations or family. But they also share what they're doing and what they care about. So you learn about other people's roles through the communication. So that's something that I've really enjoyed that came out of COVID. And then the third piece I do is I try and actually meet everybody in the organisation sort of once a year, even for half an hour, just so, again, to cater to that, to the fact that everybody's an individual. And so I like to at least have had one conversation about them and what they're getting from OMass and what they're looking for from OMass, so that I know about it as I watch them in sort of bigger meetings, or talk to their boss about their, how the team's doing. So those are some sort of my go-tos for communication.
Definitely living the value of care within the organization, I can see. But I love that the email, the daily email that started out as something kind of personal for you to kind of keep people connected, but has almost emerged now as this kind of cultural thing within the organization that everyone can now contribute to, and it happened just so organically, which is really, a lot of organizations struggle, I would think, to get that sense of organic cultural, development. And, it came out of something, a very challenging period, and a way of just trying to continue to connect people and live that shared value of care. So I think that's a wonderful example. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much for joining us, Ros. It was really lovely to have you on the show.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I think I will thoroughly enjoy watching all the other episodes, because the future of work is what defines all of us and our success. So really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So in this next section, we're going to talk about the artifact of the future. And this is where Barry will share one artifact from the future. It might be a concept or a physical item that may exist over some time. So what have you got for us today, Barry?
Interesting, if it's Elysia, I'm going to say a co-worker, which is a new AI-driven, fully interactive virtual avatar. So co-worker at this point has become really a best friend and co-worker for anybody that uses it, and ultimately based on AI. So as a result, can tap into wisdom and knowledge from all over the place. It's fully interactive, is also fully customizable, so we can make our virtual avatar look like whatever we want them to look like. And in many instances, this virtual avatar will become a friend, not just a co-worker of those who are really interested in making virtual friends. So co-worker, our AI-driven, fully interactive virtual avatar. That's an interesting object for the future of work.
Amazing. I think that's really important. I think because sometimes we're talking an awful lot about AI, and people can't really necessarily vision what it might be or how it might be able to support us. A lot of people will have this fear of AI coming to take our jobs, whereas I think co-worker, as you've explained it, is something that can really support your work and life.
Yeah, I'm excited by it actually, because, obviously, Elysia, we're looking a lot at Industry 5.0, and a lot of people are talking about how AI is going to reshape work. I'm actually really interested in how AI can become this co-worker that enhances our productivity, our efficiency, our thinking, our curiosity, etc. And I know there's a lot of fear out there in terms of AI, and there are mixed views on what AI is going to do to us and to our roles. I know, when we're looking at the moment, we're getting mixed perspectives, but I think ultimately it can be a massive support to those people who really want to harness it, and can be really, really effective, So yeah, co-worker, keep an eye on it. And now, guys, we have some very exciting news. Elysia, I'm going to let you spill the cat out of the bag, as they say.
Yeah, so we're excited to tell everyone that we will be launching our Future Work World Network into the UK with an exclusive event on the 17th of April in London at 9 a.m. So you can click below and you can find out more about the event and how to register and join us. And you will also receive complimentary membership to Future Work World if you haven't registered already.
Thanks, Elysia. Sounds good. I'm excited already.
Yes.
And so, guys, we come to the end of our Future Work World podcast. Great for you all for listening today. Thank you very much.
And don't forget to hit subscribe and follow us on Apple, Spotify or YouTube.